ligesom give over til mig.
Vi er online.
Well, welcome back. I hope you all had a great lunch. So I have the pleasure of being the chair of this afternoon session. And the first speaker of this afternoon is Associate Professor Einar Baldursson, who's a psychologist from Aalborg University. And the topic of his talk is going to be the interaction between social pain and stress, identity and motivation. And I'm going to leave the rest of explaining this very interesting topic to you, Einar.
Thank you, and thank for the invite. And I will now share my screen. Start with a picture of happier times. This is going to be somewhat different from the other presentations today, but hopefully interesting and even inspiring. My focus on pain, of course, reflects the fact that I am an occupational health psychologist and have both worked as a researcher and within the field of prevention. During my years at the Departments of Occupational Medicine, I started to migrate to a clinical perspective on occupational health psychology, involving focus on pain and psychological pain treatment. In the late 90s, this reflects my age, 19 is recently. In the 90s, we started to see a new type of patients. They're better educated and with a very different stress profile than we had seen before. So after 2000, I turned my focus on workers in knowledge work. I didn't really expect pain-related problems to play a particularly prominent role, since knowledge workers rarely experience the kind of physical strain, which at that time was seen as the primary cause of work-related pain syndromes. In 2002, I started, in collaboration with a couple of colleagues, a stress clinic at the University of Aalborg. And since 2002, we have systematically recruited patients from different populations, starting with knowledge workers, later moving to younger blue-collar workers, and finally focusing on people in the human service field, still maintaining focus on younger clients. And during this entire period, focus on pain reactions has played an important role in our clinical work, research and theoretical work. In this work, we increasingly came to understand that we needed to go back to the origin of occupational health psychology to understand the new challenges in a combination of biosocial approach and social psychology. But the re-emergence of evolutionary thinking in psychology came to play a very important role in this project. In this context, we're simply thinking about basic evolutionary heuristics involving errors in reproduction, at which very few will bestow individuals with selective advantage. The interesting thing here is, of course, that the selector is the environment. Less obviously, the social environment plays a very important role in selection with social species. And since human beings can be characterized as an ultra-social species, selection for survival is overwhelmingly selection for social survival. And in this context, we have to remind ourselves that evolution happens without foresight. Whatever is selected for cannot be regretted. Evolution is an impressive but not a good designer. Everything new usually does not work out that well. In numerous modifications over time are usually required to make a new system work in a robust manner. For this reason, we do not expect the recent designs to work very well. And the human psyche is an example of a number of recent evolutionary designs. Not only are these designs new, but these systems have to navigate in and deal with an ever-changing and very complicated environment. Given the very short time evolution has had to produce these systems, they should be in a state of almost perpetual dysfunction and breakdown. And that is not how it appears. And to make the mystery even greater, the human social environment has been going through an impressive number of fundamental changes and development in a very short time, approximately 15,000 years. So either these systems possess unsurpassed robustness and flexibility, or there are maintenance systems within this framework with an impressive ability to repair and correct problems and breakdowns. In this context, we should remember that evolution is the great recycler. Everything new is based on something old, which means that the past is always present in the now and the basis of our future. We must understand older systems which have been used to produce modern functions. The role of the pain system in psychological processes has been an increasing focus in modern research. Very inspiring findings are Mace's argument that there is a connection between sickness behavior and some forms of depression. Later, previously, Eisenberger's focus on the connection between psychological pain, or when rejection hurts, and the physical pain system. And for me and a number of my colleagues, these papers were a revelation. So what we are focusing on is the hurting self. And I want to mention one example that has played an important role in our recent research, which is cognitive dissonance. There's a general agreement within the research in cognitive dissonance that it involves a feeling of psychological pain and hurt and pain avoidance behavior, reduction of dissonance. This is an indication of a role for the pain system in psychological processes. It's fairly extensive. We have, given the nature of our clinical work, been very interested in how threats to self do involve pain-related responses. In this context, we draw on a paper, at least a book from 1988 by Stephen Hopford, and he suggested that the activation of the stress system is proportional to the value of the threatened resource. This model proposes that reactions to threats to the self are proportional to the importance of the self in the context of the threat. In situations with limited self-involvement, stress would not activate self-defense in any noticeable way. Limited involvement would only imply limited possibility of harm and damage. In situations that involve highly valued self-resources, the opposite would be expected, and the pieces of the puzzle are falling into place. Just to draw the contrast, I want to remind that one of the core features of industrial work was that it was based on purely instrumental reward in form of wages. And the organization of work systematically focused on reducing the extent of required qualification to a bare minimum. For that reason, most industrial workers base their identity and self on activities in other domains, trade unions, family, leisure time, etc. So strain at work could wear their body down, but not their self-resources. But The case is completely different for modern work. Increasingly, modern work demands qualifications that require years of training and education. And much research indicates that self-esteem responds to the investment of resources in acquiring skills and competencies. The so-called epidemic of narcissism is at least partly a reflection of the fact that more people spend a bigger part of their life in the educational system. And increasing investment means that much more is at stake than ever before. And this leads to increasing focus on one's social exchange value. We are more preoccupied with ourselves, but there is a rational calculus involved. And this is where the recent research in self-enhancement also enter into the equation, because extensive research documents that normal self-evaluation involves a considerable element of self-enhancement. Self-enhancement does seem to protect the self, as well as increasing willingness to acquire new knowledge. But it also fuels exaggerated self-expectations, expectations to what you expect to get out of your involvement in the world around you. And this brings us to motivation in the modern work, modern knowledge work. And since modern jobs require personal involvement, a different kind of motivation is brought into play than was the norm in industrial society. I've already mentioned the instrumental role of monetary motivation, but we are talking about something completely different today. And I'm basing this approach on a paper by Alan Fisker, who identified and classified types of motivations called sociality. In this context, I'm mostly interested in a type of motivation that is called social motivation. Social motivation involves focus on how the person wants the result of one's effort to reflect on his or her social reputation, value, and self-esteem. How you evaluate the result of your effort and your beliefs in how others do so become a mirror of the self. Experienced success involves strong activity in the reward system of the brain, and failures are punished by weakened self-esteem. The allure of social motivation at work is the promise of over-involvement, sometimes called work alcoholism, completely unknown before. And now we bring social media and self-comparison into the picture. The self-comparison system is evolved to manage comparison to a limited number of others, as a rule in a cooperative context. Even a hierarchical defeat could be managed within a social meaning focusing on contribution within a system of cooperative division of labor. Being okay was good enough. The social media have revolutionized our world and the context of our evolved psyche in a manner we're only beginning to understand. It may very well be one of the major revolutions of human history, but an immense world of social comparison is also a limitless risk of defeat in social comparison. In this context, it's especially important to note that in modern work, self-esteem is one of the strongest defenses against stress. But also that weakened self-esteem, and now I'm implicitly referring to recent studies we have been doing, weakened self-esteem seems to involve enhanced pain and stress reactions. In a work setting, these changes indicate that self-related involvement in work also increases adverse reactions to threat to that same self at work. This, as is the case for our immune system, that which protects us also can harm us. The argument is that the evolution of the human social psyche draws on the pain system in several ways. The proposition is that the self is increasingly at play at the center of modern work, and that the reactions to stress and strain at work will therefore increasingly involve experiences of psychological pain. This has implications for diagnosis, treatment, and certainly also how to focus on preventive efforts in modern working environment. And that was the contribution, shorter than I thought.
Well, thank you very much for a very nice and interesting presentation. I really like the overview of how this has moved over time. I would like to ask you one question, but more from a clinical perspective. So when you meet some of these people in a clinical setting where you see that stress and all these things may not live up to their expectations, how do you address it?
Well, firstly, there are several symptoms of this process that are worth mentioning. Self-distrust and even self-hate plays a crucial role when this process has been going on for a while. Most of the basic introductory methods have not changed through time. So we basically always start with normalization, psychoeducation. And the advantage of psychoeducation is that you stop seeing yourself as crazy. You start to include yourself as a normal part of the normal population. But we have found that self-marginalization, the implicit idea that you are not a worthy member of the community, is a fairly stable construct after a long period of self-involved, stressful work conditions. And that is a much more difficult problem to address.
Yeah, and one of the things that, when I am not at university doing research, I see patients. And one of the things I'm always curious about is how do you address this? Because you make it sound very easy, and what would you say to a patient? Like, how would you open up that discussion on getting them to normalize their image?
It's definitely not easy. It's definitely not easy. It's actually quite difficult. As far as long-term exposure to stress and increasing self-negativity leads to changes in self-image, the results of that require a fairly long-term psychological intervention. When I point towards the importance of psychoeducational approaches, it's basically because it decreases the level of anxiety. And through that, the patient gets more resources we can mobilize for further work. But the basic question you are asking, how can we get people to forgive themselves for not being the persons they would like to be? Because they come to almost despise themselves. They come selectively to prefer negative feedback. So everything that the normal psyche, and these people are normal, you and me. So that's a part of the scary thing about this. They're not abnormal. Our experiences indicate that the protective systems in the psyche can be turned topsy-turvy. So self-enhanchement, which is extremely good at selecting positive information and enhances the self to a level where you feel pretty good with yourself. There is something that indicates that this process can be reversely polarized. So instead of selecting for positive information, you start to look for negative information. And the thing is, most of our environment doesn't have that much negative information. People treat each other usually quite nicely. And then they start to question the positive input they get from others. And they start to believe that people are faking it. They're trying to hide the fact that the patient is an awful person. And if that gets to evolve further, they start to develop a kind of paranoia with the role of maintaining negative identity. So the processes that generate normal identity and positive identity, which are quite powerful, are also quite powerful when they generate the exact opposite. And it's fairly characteristic for this process that this involves quite a lot of pain. Pain is very central in this. So one of the approaches is to find any way in which the experience of pain can be reduced, because that is a second approach that releases resources. We need a lot of resources for reorientation of the self-concept. Also, that even if the forces at work are quite powerful, they're not almighty. And facts prevail to a certain degree. So classical cognitive behavioral approach in the form of minuscule, concrete activities whose positive result cannot be questioned by this negative system in the psyche are a very important building block in this second phase of the treatment. When that starts to work, we often use a kind of social inclusion related to compassion therapy, which is to say, if you looked at yourself through the eyes of another, how would you feel about being talked about in the manner that you do yourself? Would you accept being treated so badly if somebody else was a victim? And we maintain realistic understanding of how we deal with each other, even when we are treating ourselves very badly.
Yeah.
And then the final phase. What about forgiving yourself? And perhaps face the fact that there are things you're quite good at. And that's the most difficult understanding to accept, because part of self-negativity is freedom from expectation.
Thank you very much for this explanation. We have a question here, burnout is a topic that seems to be gaining both interest but also there is a lot of or becoming increasing amount of research on it. How much can we actually blame on work and workload, and how much is other aspects of this?
Well, this is the classic and everlasting question. Life is at home, and never more than now. It's worth reminding ourselves on how different life in industrial society was. I love the song Peter Seeger made very popular, Little Houses, where it describes a world in which every aspect of life is boxed into a little box separate from every other little box. While we live in a completely different world. So everything interacts with everything else. I usually describe it in this manner since I experienced it. It's one of few advantages of age, that you have seen things happening. In the beginning, the work started to infect the rest of people's lives. If you look at the changes in Denmark through the last 30 years, leisure life has virtually disappeared. participation in trade unions, political parties, and different types of organized leisure life have plummeted. Why? Well, in industrial society, every part that was outside work was a source of identity and self-respect. But as work became interesting and became a better proposal for meaning in life, work started to overtake other parts of life. But then, of course, the rest of our life took revenge. And social media started to influence work. Everybody who teaches knows how difficult it is to teach people who are on Facebook. Perhaps we should teach them through Facebook, but that's another discussion. So the world outside work took its revenge. So now everything is intermingled. But this also means that one of the classic questions from industrial society, how much of this is because of your family, has lost its meaning, because family has much less a role to play than ever before. So I think we have to say work is today the most essential source of self-esteem and self-experience. It's also one of the most rewarding domains in life at all. So it plays a role that is bigger than ever before. Burnout. Sorry if my answers are long-winded. Burnout was in the 60s a very important breakthrough, because burnout was the first example of a specific response to stress. At that time, we all believed that the stress syndrome was general and non-specific. So Christina Maslach's findings that stress under certain circumstances would change our ability to empathize with others was a revolutionary breakthrough, and only now we are able to understand the full implications of this. My personal theory is that this requires much better and more detailed diagnosis of stress-related syndromes than we had before. And perhaps we need to develop different types of diagnosis of different types of burnout, because the original burnout was burnout in relation to empathy. We're also seeing chronic exhaustion, which might be a different kind of burnout, probably changes in the systems related to the regulation of energy through hippocampus. So I think we need a much more nuanced and rich diagnostic vocabulary now.
Thank you very much. We have, do we have time for more? Yes. So we have a few more questions. And one of them is regarding, do you think it needs a skilled psychologist to address these things, or could a physiotherapist or another healthcare provider also start addressing these in a clinical setting?
I would turn the question around and say, is psychology enough? And the answer would be no. The thing is that physical manipulation, the physical approach, is a tool in addressing the consequences of chronic stress. That's very interesting and very important. I like to tell stories. I come from Iceland. I had a patient that suffered from sleeplessness. She had found it difficult to sleep for a very, very long time. So I ran her through the entire classical system of reducing her anxiety and stress, and it improved the situation somewhat. The problem was that her stress system was frozen at a very high level. This is what chronic stress is. The response loses its dynamics. So I started looking in other directions. And I found out, this was during the winter, by the way, that she formerly had been a winter bather. So I proposed that perhaps she should try that again. So she did that and threw herself into the ice-cold water of the sea, something I would never do myself. And this partly unfroze her stress system. So her stress system started regaining some of its normal vitality and variability. I think we can get the same result without throwing people into ice cold sea by widening our approach to treatment. Yes, so I think a physical approach to treating stress is an important part of future treatment strategies.
Thank you very much. Another question we got on the Facebook chat here. If a patient has a negative attitude related to pain, would you ask the patient about his life habits as well, or how would you approach this?
Well, the tradition I come from, which is the classic tradition of occupational health psychology in Denmark, is fascinated by ordinary work, ordinary life. So when we treat patients, we really discuss everything in a patient's life. One of the reasons why we do this is that the past often includes resources that can be activated to mend problems at the present. One of the methods we use is nostalgia. We remember significant experience from our past, just like system recovery in Windows. We can activate these memories and for a short while bring people back to a different time and use that vantage point to rephrase problems in current living. Of course, we also cover other areas in people's lives, if for nothing else, but then to identify comorbid problems that are independent of work and stress at work.
Well, I think that you bring up some very interesting aspects that at least I will bring with me the next time I see patients in a clinical setting, and definitely need to consider a bit more thoroughly than I've done so far, I think. But hopefully that should also be the case, since this is what you've been doing most of your life.
And what I have left of it.
Fair enough. Yeah. I don't think we really have any more questions in the commentary. So I would like to say thank you so much for your very interesting perspective and presentation on this topic. And I think it's very important to spread this knowledge of these topics in relations to work-related pain. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me.